Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The historical perception of German panzers during the Second World War often centers on a narrative of technological supremacy, where massive, heavily armored vehicles like the Tiger and Panther dominated the battlefield, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer numerical weight of inferior, Allied tanks like the American M4 Sherman or the Soviet T-34. However, a rigorous historical analysis reveals that the failure of German armor was not merely a matter of quantity overcoming quality, but rather a fundamental mismatch between German engineering philosophy and the brutal realities of total war logistics, strategic mobility, and mechanical reliability. The notion that Allied armor was weaker is a simplification that ignores the vital metrics of ergonomics, visibility, repairability, and operational availability, all of which favored the Allies and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Panzerwaffe. One of the primary reasons for the failure of German heavy armor was the obsession with tactical overmatching at the expense of operational reliability. German tank design, particularly from 1943 onwards, shifted toward heavy and super-heavy vehicles. While a Tiger I or a Tiger II possessed armor that was nearly impenetrable from the front at long ranges and a main gun that could destroy any Allied tank with ease, these advantages were often negated by the vehicle's catastrophic mechanical fragility. The Tiger II, for instance, was powered by the same Maybach HL-230 engine used in the much lighter Panther, which placed immense strain on the transmission and final drives. In the mud of the Eastern Front or the hedgerows of Normandy, these heavy tanks frequently suffered from mechanical breakdowns before they ever saw combat. A tank that is stuck in a ditch with a shattered final drive is effectively a static pillbox, and once the front line shifted, these multi-million Reichsmark machines were often abandoned and destroyed by their own crews because they were too heavy to be towed by standard recovery vehicles. The complexity of German engineering also created a logistical nightmare. Unlike the Allied approach, which prioritized standardization and ease of maintenance, German tanks were often handcrafted with tight tolerances that made them difficult to repair in field conditions. The infamous interleaved road wheel system, known as the Schachtellaufwerk, provided excellent weight distribution and a stable firing platform, but it was a disaster for maintenance. If an inner road wheel was damaged by a mine or a mechanical failure, crews had to remove multiple outer wheels to reach it. In freezing conditions on the Soviet front, mud and ice would pack into these wheels and freeze solid overnight, effectively immobilizing the tank. In contrast, the M4 Sherman was designed with the vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, and later the horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, which were modular and could be repaired or replaced quickly by crews or forward maintenance units. The industrial philosophy of the Third Reich further exacerbated these issues. Germany treated tank production as a craft rather than a mass production process. There were constant iterative changes to designs even while they were on the assembly line, which meant that two tanks of the same model produced a few months apart might have non-interchangeable parts. This created a chaotic supply chain where spare parts were perpetually in short supply. On the other hand, the United States and the Soviet Union embraced the principles of Fordism. The M4 Sherman was produced in massive quantities across multiple factories with standardized parts, ensuring that a tank damaged in combat could be quickly repaired using components scavenged from other knocked-out vehicles or from a robust supply chain that spanned the Atlantic. The Soviet T-34 was similarly designed for mass production, with a focus on good enough quality that allowed the Red Army to sustain massive losses and still maintain a crushing numerical advantage. Furthermore, the Allied tanks were not as weak as popular history suggests. The M4 Sherman, while initially outclassed in terms of raw armor thickness and gun caliber by the heavy German Cats, was an exceptionally well-balanced fighting machine. It featured a Euro-stabilized main gun, which, although not perfect, gave American crews a significant advantage when firing on the move or quickly after halting. The Sherman also had superior ergonomics and visibility. The commander's cupola and the general layout allowed for faster target acquisition. In tank combat, the side that spots the enemy first and fires the first effective shot usually wins, regardless of armor thickness. The Sherman's fast turret traverse, powered by an electric or hydraulic motor, allowed it to track and engage targets much faster than a Tiger, whose turret traverse was often painfully slow and dependent on engine RPM. When the Allies introduced up-gunned variants like the Sherman Firefly with the 17-pounder gun or the M4 76W, they possessed the firepower to penetrate the front of most German tanks at combat ranges, closing the quality gap. The Soviet T-34 also presented a revolutionary design that the Germans initially struggled to counter. Its sloped armor effectively increased its relative thickness without adding the dead weight of vertical plates, and its wide tracks provided excellent flotation on soft ground and snow, terrains where German panzers often bogged down. While the T-34 suffered from poor crew ergonomics and a lack of radios in earlier models, the 1944 introduction of the T-34-85 addressed many of these deficiencies, providing a potent combination of mobility, protection, and firepower that could be produced by the tens of thousands. The strategic context of the war also played a decisive role. By 1944, Germany was forced into a defensive posture, which meant their tanks were often used as mobile anti-tank platforms rather than the spearheads of blitzkrieg. In a defensive role, the heavy armor of the Tiger was useful, but it could not overcome the Allied dominance of the skies. Allied tactical air power, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons, created a tactical paralysis for German armored units. Even if Allied rockets and bombs rarely achieved a direct hit on a tank, they decimated the fuel trucks, ammunition columns, and repair shops that the panzers relied upon. A Tiger II without fuel is nothing more than a very expensive piece of scrap metal. The Allies' ability to interdict German logistics meant that German armor often entered battle understrength, low on fuel, and without adequate infantry support. Another critical factor was the decline in the quality of German tank crews and the degradation of steel quality. Early in the war, the Panzerwaffe was staffed by highly trained, experienced veterans. However, by 1944, the staggering losses on the Eastern Front had bled the German army white. New crews were rushed to the front with minimal training, often having never driven their tanks for more than a few hours due to fuel shortages. In contrast, Allied crews, while perhaps less experienced in terms of years, were well-fed, well-supported, and benefited from a training regimen that emphasized combined arms tactics. Simultaneously, as Germany lost access to vital alloying elements like molybdenum and manganese, the quality of their armor plate plummeted. Late-war German steel became brittle. Even if an Allied shell did not penetrate, the internal surface of the German armor would often spall, sending shards of metal flying through the interior of the tank and killing or wounding the crew. The concept of force multipliers also favored the Allies. The M4 Sherman was part of a sophisticated combined arms system that included advanced radio communication, dedicated armored infantry, panzergrenadiers, and, most importantly, highly responsive and devastatingly accurate divisional artillery. When a Sherman encountered a Tiger it could not defeat frontally, it did not simply engage in a suicidal charge. It used smoke to obscure the enemy's vision, called in artillery to suppress the German position, or coordinated with specialized tank destroyers like the M10 or M36. The Allied philosophy treated the tank as one component of a larger machine, whereas the Germans often placed an unrealistic burden on the individual technical specifications of the tank itself to win the day. Logistics, often described as the dull part of history, was actually the decisive edge. The American Red Ball Express and the Soviet rail network ensured that Allied tanks remained operational. The Germans, conversely, relied heavily on horse-drawn logistics for their infantry divisions, creating a massive disparity in speed and sustainability between their armored spearheads and their supporting elements. When German tanks broke through, they often outran their own supplies, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. When they were forced to retreat, the lack of heavy recovery equipment and the unreliability of their own vehicles led to the abandonment of hundreds of heavy tanks that could have been repaired if they belonged to the Allied side. The sheer economic reality was that the Allied powers could afford to lose tanks and replace them, whereas every German loss was irreplaceable. The United States produced approximately 50,000 Shermans, and the Soviet Union produced over 84,000 T-34s of all variants. Germany, by comparison, produced only about 1,350 Tiger Is, 500 Tiger IIs, and 6,000 Panthers. Even with a kill ratio that favored the Germans in many engagements, the mathematical inevitability of the conflict meant that the Allies could sustain their losses while the Germans could not. The quality of the German tanks was essentially an illusion of the tactical level that vanished when viewed from an operational or strategic perspective. A tank is only as good as its ability to reach the battlefield, stay operational during the fight, and be repaired after the engagement. By those metrics, the weaker Allied tanks were actually the superior weapons of war. The final months of the war illustrated this perfectly. In the Battle of the Bulge, German heavy tanks were hampered by narrow, winding roads and bridges that could not support their weight. Many were simply abandoned because they ran out of fuel or suffered minor mechanical failures that could not be fixed. Meanwhile, the Allied armored divisions, despite the harsh winter, maintained a level of mobility that allowed them to respond to breakthroughs and eventually crush the German offensive. The myth of the superior German tank persists because of its impressive appearance and its dominance in isolated, small-scale tactical duels. But in the context of a global, industrial total war, the German focus on technical complexity, heavy armor, and massive guns was a strategic error. The Allied commitment to reliability, mass production, and combined arms integration proved that a weaker tank in a superior system will almost always defeat a stronger tank in a failing one. When analyzing the metallurgy further, the impact of the Allied strategic bombing campaign cannot be overstated. By targeting German industrial centers and power grids, the Allies forced the decentralization of tank production. Components were made in small workshops and then transported to final assembly points, which further degraded the consistency and quality control of the vehicles. The brittle nature of late-war German face-hardened armor meant that even non-penetrating hits from high-explosive shells or smaller-caliber armor-piercing rounds could cause the internal welds to fail. There are numerous accounts of Panther tanks whose front glacis plates cracked or whose turrets jammed after being hit by 75mm rounds that technically should not have been able to damage them. This structural instability turned the German advantage of thick armor into a liability, as the crew could no longer trust the integrity of their vehicle under sustained fire. In terms of mobility, the German tanks were also hindered by their own weight in ways that went beyond mechanical failure. Their high ground pressure meant they were restricted to paved roads or very firm ground, especially during the Rasputitsa mud season in Russia. The T-34 and the later versions of the Sherman with wider tracks could traverse terrain that would swallow a Tiger or a Panther. This gave the Allies a massive tactical advantage in choosing the direction of their attacks and flanking German positions. The ability to bypass a German heavy tank unit and cut off its retreat or its supply lines was often more effective than engaging it in a head-on fight. The Germans were essentially building land battleships in an era where speed, flexibility, and mass were the true keys to victory on land. Ultimately, the German tanks did not lose because they were weaker in a vacuum. They lost because they were poorly suited for the specific war they were fighting. They were over-engineered for a short, decisive conflict, blitzkrieg, that had long since evolved into a grinding war of attrition. The Allied armor, characterized by the Sherman and T-34, was designed for that attrition. They were the tools of a modern, industrial, and global military effort that understood that a tank's value is measured by its presence on the front line, not just its performance in a controlled firing range. The failure of German armor was a failure of the entire German military-industrial philosophy, a lesson that complexity and raw power are no substitute for reliability, logistics, and the ability to operate within a cohesive, well-supported tactical framework. The victory of the weaker Allied armor was, in fact, the victory of a more sophisticated and realistic understanding of 20th-century warfare.